The lilies were dying before they even reached the altar. Browning at the edges, their petals curling inward like fists clenching against the August heat that had settled over Richmond like a punishment. The air shimmered above car hoods in waves you could mistake for water if you were desperate enough. Even the birds had gone silent, surrendering the sky to a sun that bleached the color from everything it touched. Inside the Glenmore Memorial Chapel, the air conditioning had been losing its war since sunrise, and now, at 2:30 in the afternoon, the temperature inside was only marginally better than the furnace outside. Ceiling fans churned lazily overhead, pushing warm air from one corner to another without conviction. The flowers arranged along the front of the chapel, three elaborate displays flanking a closed mahogany casket, were wilting visibly, their colors bleeding away hour by hour like watercolors left in the rain. The scent of them mixed with furniture polish and the faint chemical undertone of embalming fluid that no ventilation could mask. And beneath it all, silence. Not peaceful silence, but the heavy, suffocating silence of grief held too tightly, of words swallowed before they could escape, of a room full of people who had come to mourn a woman they all claimed to love, but none of them had truly understood. Sable Voss had been awake for 31 hours, not by choice, though she had stopped making that distinction sometime around 4 in the morning when she'd pricked her thumb on a rose thorn for the 6th time and barely felt it. The numbness had set in long before that, a full-body anesthesia that dulled everything from her reflexes to her emotions, leaving her operating on nothing but muscle memory and the stubborn refusal to quit that had defined every chapter of her 27 years on this earth. She stood at the back of the chapel now, half hidden behind a pillar near the entrance, her dark hands stained green from hours of cutting stems and wiring arrangements, her apron still damp from hauling water back and forth from her van since before dawn. Her locks were pulled up in a high wrap, secured with a strip of fabric she'd torn from a roll of ribbon when she couldn't find a hair tie, and there were shadows beneath her brown eyes so deep they looked like bruises. She didn't belong here. Not really. She was a florist, not a mourner, and the arrangement she'd been hired to create for today's memorial was supposed to have been a straightforward job. 3 large displays, 24 boutonnieres, a casket spray of white gardenias and pale pink peonies. Standard funeral work. She could do it in her sleep, and given the circumstances, she very nearly had. But nothing about this job had been straightforward from the moment she'd accepted it. The call had come 5 days ago from a woman whose voice carried authority that didn't ask for things so much as inform you that you would be providing them. Mrs. Park. No first name offered, none requested. She had described what she wanted with surgical precision. Specific flowers, exact shades, and an arrangement style that referenced traditional Korean funeral aesthetics, blended with Western memorial customs. Sable quoted her price, and Mrs. Park doubled it without hesitation, adding only one condition. They must be perfect. My daughter-in-law deserved perfect, and I will accept nothing less. Sable had spent 4 days sourcing flowers from 3 wholesalers, driving 2 hours to a specialty grower in Fredericksburg for white chrysanthemums Mrs. Park insisted upon, and working through 2 consecutive nights in her cramped studio to build arrangements that met a standard she wasn't sure any living florist could achieve. She had burned through her monthly supply budget, postponed 2 other client orders, and skipped meals she couldn't afford to skip because the work demanded every ounce of her attention. And now she was here, standing in a chapel full of strangers, watching her flowers wilt in the heat and wondering if any of it had been worth it. The crowd was larger than she'd expected. Nearly 200 people filled the pews, dressed in dark, expensive clothing that whispered of money and influence. She recognized no one, which was normal for funeral work, but there was something about this gathering that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention. It wasn't just grief she sensed. It was tension, living in the spaces between people who shared secrets they could never speak aloud, pressing against you until you wanted to collect your check and leave before you learned something you weren't supposed to know. She was adjusting the casket spray for the third time, coaxing a gardenia back into position with trembling fingers, when the voice hit her like a slap. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Sable turned to find a woman bearing down on her with the focused intensity of someone who had identified a problem and intended to eliminate it. She was tall, angular, immaculately dressed in a black sheath dress that probably cost more than Sable's rent. Her blonde hair was swept into a chignon so tight it seemed to be pulling her eyebrows upward, and her face wore an expression of concentrated disdain that made Sable take an instinctive step backward, her hip bumping the edge of the casket. "I'm the florist," Sable said, steadying herself. "I'm just adjusting the—" "I can see what you're doing. What I want to know is why you're still here." The flowers were supposed to be delivered and arranged before the guests arrived. "This isn't a workshop. This is a memorial service." The arrangements needed last-minute adjustments because of the heat. The gardenias. The gardenias are wilting because they're gardenias in August, which anyone with a basic understanding of floristry would have anticipated. The woman stepped closer, lowering her voice to a hiss that was somehow more cutting than her full volume. "Do you have any idea whose memorial this is? Do you have any idea who is in this room right now?" Sable felt heat rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the broken air conditioning. She had spent 4 days pouring everything she had into these arrangements. Driven across the state for chrysanthemums, hand-wired 200 individual stems, built a casket spray she considered one of the finest pieces she'd ever produced. And now, this perfectly coiffed stranger who probably couldn't tell a peony from a carnation was acting as though Sable had wandered in off the street to vandalize the proceedings. "I was hired to do a job," Sable said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she wanted to admit. "I'm making sure it's done right. That's all. Your job was done the moment the last arrangement was placed. Now you're loitering. And frankly, your presence is inappropriate. This is a private service for family and close associates, not a venue for the hired help to linger." The woman produced a business card from her clutch, holding it out between two fingers like she was offering a treat to a dog she didn't particularly like. "Send your invoice to this address. I'll make sure you're compensated. But I need you to leave. Now." Sable stared at the card, then at the woman, and a hardness settled inside her chest like clay fired in a kiln. She had dealt with people who looked at her and saw nothing but the service she provided, who treated her like furniture that had overstayed its welcome. She had learned to swallow the anger, to smile through the condescension. But 31 hours without sleep had stripped away every layer of professional armor, and what was left underneath was raw and entirely unwilling to be dismissed. "I was hired by Mrs. Park," Sable said, and she watched the woman's expression flicker at the name. "She hired me directly. She approved every element of these arrangements, and she asked me to stay through the service to maintain them. So unless Mrs. Park herself tells me to leave, I'm not going anywhere." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Park is elderly and sentimental, and she doesn't make the decisions about events like these. I do. I'm Vanessa Cole, and I organized this entire memorial on behalf of the family." She straightened to her full height, which was considerable, and fixed Sable with a look that could have frozen the August heat solid. "The family wants you to leave. I'm asking politely, but I won't ask again." She could feel eyes on her, dozens of them, the weight of attention from people she didn't know pressing against her skin. Her hands were shaking at her sides. She opened her mouth to respond when a voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Vanessa!" The single word carried more authority than everything the blonde woman had said combined. It was soft, but underneath it was something immovable, something that did not bend or negotiate or repeat itself. "That is enough." Sable turned and found herself looking at a small woman in her late 60s, dressed entirely in black, silver-streaked dark hair pulled back from a face striking in its stillness. She moved through the crowd with unhurried grace, and people stepped aside for her instinctively, compelled by something deeper than politeness. Mrs. Park. It had to be. And the look she was giving Vanessa Cole could have peeled lacquer from the pews. Mrs. Park, I was simply... You are embarrassing yourself and insulting a woman I personally invited to be here today. Mrs. Park's voice never rose, but it filled every corner of the chapel. She came to stand beside Sable, and despite barely reaching Sable's shoulder, her presence made the younger woman feel like a child standing in the shadow of a mountain. Miss Voss created these arrangements as a tribute to my daughter-in-law. She did so at my request, to my specifications, and with a level of care and artistry that I doubt you could recognize, let alone replicate. She turned to Sable, and her expression softened into something warm and real. They are beautiful, child. Una would have loved them. The words hit Sable like a wave, and she felt her eyes sting with tears she could not shed. Not here. Not in front of 200 strangers and a woman who had just tried to throw her out like yesterday's garbage. Thank you, Sable managed. Mrs. Park nodded once, then turned back to Vanessa with an expression frozen over like a lake in January. Miss Voss will remain for the duration of the service. She will sit with me, in the front row, as my personal guest. And you, Vanessa, will not speak to her again. Is that understood? Vanessa's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. No sound came out. After a moment that stretched into eternity, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the crowd, with whatever remained of her dignity. Mrs. Park took Sable's arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and guided her toward the front of the chapel. Sable went, too stunned and too drained to resist, her mind spinning with questions she didn't dare ask. Who was this woman? The way 200 people in expensive clothing had gone absolutely still at the sound of her voice spoke of something far beyond ordinary social authority. And as Mrs. Park settled her into the front pew, patting her hand with maternal gentleness, Sable noticed something that made the blood slow in her veins. Every man in the first 3 rows was watching her with the flat, assessing gaze of people who catalogued threats for a living. And in the second row, directly behind her, a man in a charcoal suit was studying her with an intensity that held no expression at all, his jaw tight, his posture coiled with a predatory stillness. Something patient. Something that had just become very interested in the florist who had ended up beside his mother. Dae-jung Kong had learned to read rooms the way most people read books, by starting at the beginning, noting the important details, and anticipating the ending long before it arrived. It was a skill cultivated through 2 decades of navigating a world where misreading a single glance could mean the difference between breathing and bleeding. His father had taught him the basics before dying in a manner the police ruled accidental, and everyone else understood was anything but. His uncle refined the education with lessons that left scars, and by the time Dae-jung assumed control of the Kong family's operations at 29, he could walk into any room on any continent and know within 30 seconds who was dangerous, who was useful, and who was lying. The woman in the front row was none of these things, and that was what made her interesting. He had noticed her before the confrontation, clocked her presence the moment he arrived. She was out of place, a brush stroke of raw color against a canvas of carefully blended neutrals. Everyone else had dressed for the careful theater of public grief, for the meticulous performance of sorrow that people in his world had elevated to something between art and obligation. But this woman in her stained apron and her improvised hair wrap had been dressed for real work, the kind that left evidence on your skin, and he had dismissed her initially as irrelevant to his concerns. His attention was on the security Min-jun had put in place at every exit, the guest list that included 3 people with hostile opinions about the Kong family's interests, and the theater of mourning Yuna. his sister-in-law, his brother Seung-ho's wife of 11 years, dead at 43 from a cancer that moved with merciless efficiency. She had been one of the few genuinely good people in Dae-jung's orbit, a woman who had married into a family whose shadows she chose to illuminate rather than inhabit. Seung-ho had retreated into grief so total it resembled catatonia, leaving Dae-jung and their mother to carry the public mourning on his behalf. His mother's grief concerned him most. Yoonji Park had survived things that would have broken most people 3 times over, but grief made even the strongest people unpredictable. And unpredictability in his world was a luxury no one could afford. So when his mother rose to defend the florist, he was not surprised. What surprised him was what followed. The invitation to the front row, the gentle hand, the softness in his mother's voice that he hadn't heard directed at a stranger in years. He watched her from the second row. She was trying hard not to look around, her fingers gripping the pew's edge. She was overwhelmed. And yet, she hadn't run. She had accepted his mother's invitation with a thank you that carried more dignity than anything Vanessa Cole had ever uttered, and sat down without flinching. That took something. And Dae-jung found himself reluctantly curious about what. Minjun leaned forward, his voice a breath against Dae-jung's ear. Should I look into her? The question was routine. Anyone who entered their inner circle, even accidentally, even temporarily, was vetted. It was protocol, non-negotiable, the kind of precaution that kept people alive in a business where trust was the most expensive commodity and betrayal the most common currency. Yes. Then, after a beat too long, but gently, don't frighten her. Minjun's eyebrow rose a fraction of a millimeter, his equivalent of open-mouthed shock. In 12 years of service, Dae-jung had never modified a vetting order with concern for the subject's comfort. People were investigated or they weren't. Their feelings about the process had never been a factor. Of course, sir, Minjun said, his tone carefully neutral in the way that meant he had noted the anomaly and filed it away for future reference. The minister was speaking about Yuna's kindness, her love of gardening and cooking. The words washed over Dae-jung without landing. But the florist was listening, really listening, her whole body angled toward the minister, her lips pressed together in the way people's did when fighting to hold themselves intact. She hadn't known Yuna, and yet she was grieving, not with the performative solemnity around her, but with raw, unguarded empathy. It was the most honest thing he had witnessed in months, and he couldn't look away from it any more than he could look away from a flame in a dark room. The service ended with handshakes and murmured condolences and the slow dispersal of people who had nowhere better to channel their sadness. Sable remained in her seat, partly because Mrs. Park's grip on her hand hadn't loosened, partly because her legs had informed her that standing was a privilege they were no longer willing to grant. She needed water. She needed food. She needed 48 hours of sleep. Mrs. Park turned to her. You haven't eaten today. I had coffee this morning, Sable offered. Coffee is not food. When did you last have a real meal? Sable realized she couldn't remember. There had been a granola bar at some point, and someone at the wholesaler had offered her half a sandwich she'd eaten standing over a bucket of hydrangeas. Beyond that, the days had blurred together. I'm fine, she said. You are not fine. You are running on fumes and pride, and while I admire both, they are not sustainable. Mrs. Park stood. You will join us for the reception. There is food, and you will eat. I really should pack up my equipment. Your equipment will be handled. You created something beautiful for my Yuna at great personal cost. The least I can offer is a meal and a comfortable chair. Please. It would honor me. It was the please that did it, and how her voice bent just enough to reveal the grief underneath. This woman had just buried her daughter-in-law and was worrying about whether a florist had eaten. The kindness dissolved Sable's resistance entirely. The reception was in a private room adjacent to the chapel, transformed with the effortless elegance that only significant money could achieve. Long tables draped in white linen held an array of Korean and Western dishes. Mrs. Park guided her to a table near the window and pressed a plate into her hands with instructions that carried the unmistakable weight of a command. She was halfway through her second plate, having discovered a variety of japchae that was transcendently good, when someone sat down across from her. She looked up, chopsticks frozen, and met the gaze of the man from the second row. Up close, he was devastating in a way her exhausted brain struggled to process. Not conventionally handsome. His face had too many angles for that, too much intensity concentrated in features designed for gravity rather than charm. His eyes were the color of black coffee held up to light, and they watched her with focused stillness. He had removed his suit jacket, sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing a watch that probably cost more than her van, and the suggestion of a tattoo above his left wrist. He didn't say anything immediately, just sat there watching her eat, his expression hovering between amusement and something she couldn't identify. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted, like the air before a storm decides which direction to move. "You have sauce on your chin," he said finally. Sable's hand flew to her face, napkin deployed at speed. Her cheeks burned. "Thanks. That's definitely how I wanted to make a first impression. Covered in food at a memorial." "I wouldn't say covered. It was a very small amount." "Oh, well, totally dignified." She set down her chopsticks. "Who are you? And if you're about to try to throw me out too, your mother already overruled that decision." Something cracked in his expression. Surprise, or the beginning of a smile. "My mother?" "Mrs. Park. She's your mother, isn't she? You were behind her during the service, and you have the same—" she searched for the word. "The same way of looking at people. Like you're reading a book you've already decided whether or not to finish." The crack widened into a smile, small and controlled but real, and it transformed his face the way sunrise transforms a landscape, not adding anything new, but revealing what darkness had been hiding. "I'm Daejung. I came to apologize for Vanessa." She overstepped. "You don't need to apologize for her. Everything that happens in this room is my responsibility." He said it without arrogance, and it landed not as a boast but as a burden stated plainly. "Including making sure the woman my mother invited is treated with the respect she deserves." Sable studied him. There was something about how people moved around this man, how conversations paused when he entered a space, how Minjun positioned himself with the constant awareness of a satellite orbiting a planet. "What do you do, Daejung?" "I run the family business." The pause that followed was filled with everything those 5 words didn't say. "And what kind of business?" "The kind that requires discretion, and the kind that makes it unusual for someone to ask me direct questions." Should I stop? No. The word came faster than the others, and something in his expression suggested it surprised him as much as her. "It's refreshing. Most people are more careful around me. Most people haven't been awake for 31 hours. My filter stopped working around hour 26. You're getting the unedited version." "Don't apologize. The unedited version is far more interesting." He glanced toward the door where Minjun had materialized. "Can I offer you a ride home? You shouldn't be driving in your condition." "My condition being exhaustion or sauce-faced at a memorial?" "Both." Sable laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh that sounded strange in a room still heavy with mourning. Several heads turned. "I shouldn't have laughed." "Yuna would have liked that. She always said our family took itself too seriously." He stood. "Minjun will follow your van home. It would put my mother's mind at ease. Once she decides to worry about someone, arguing is futile." Sable felt something stir in the back of her mind. A warning. The voice that had kept her alive through every hard year, telling her this was a door she should not open. She opened it anyway. Tell Minjun to keep up. I drive fast when I'm tired. A week passed. Then two. Sable returned to her shop on Carey Street and threw herself into ordinary life. Orders came and went. Wedding consultations, corporate arrangements, the steady trickle of bouquets that kept the lights on. She swept floors, answered phones, mixed preservative solutions, and tried to stop thinking about the memorial. About Mrs. Park's hand on her arm. About a man named Dae Jung who had pointed out sauce on her chin and offered her a ride home with a certainty that was not accustomed to hearing no. She had driven home that night with Minjun's sedan in her rearview mirror, a silent escort that should have felt threatening, but instead felt like safety. He waited until she was inside before pulling away, and she stood at her window watching his taillights disappear with the confused disorientation of waking from a dream that hadn't finished its story. She didn't hear from any of them. No call, no message, no mysterious sedan. By the end of the second week, she had convinced herself the whole thing was an anomaly, a strange intersection of her world and a different one entirely. On Monday morning of the third week, a delivery truck pulled up outside her shop. Sable watched from behind the counter as two men unloaded a commercial-grade floral cooler, the kind that maintained precise temperature and humidity, the kind she'd been dreaming about since she opened her shop 3 years ago and discovered her second-hand unit was slowly murdering every delicate bloom she put inside it. There must be a mistake. I didn't order this. Delivery for Voss Floral, 412 Carey Street. Paid in full. The man held out a clipboard. Where do you want it? Who paid for it? He shrugged. Corporate account, no name, just the address and a note. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a single card, heavy cream stock, written in a precise, unhurried hand. Your gardenias deserve better than to die before they reach the altar. Consider this a professional courtesy. DK. She read it 3 times while the delivery men waited with patient exasperation. Inside, against the back wall. She spent the day rearranging around the cooler, which was magnificent, equipment that belonged in a high-end studio, not a shop where the owner ate ramen 3 nights running when wholesale orders came in high. She transferred her inventory and watched declining blooms perk up within the hour. The temperature held. The humidity was perfect. Gardenias that had been drooping since yesterday straightened like students hearing the bell, and a batch of dahlias she'd written off as losses unfurled another 1/4 inch of petal before her eyes. But the card sat on her counter like an unexploded ordnance, a professional courtesy from a man whose profession operated in territories that word didn't typically describe. She turned it over twice, ran her thumb across the embossed initials, and set it down. Picked it up again. Set it down again. She picked up the phone 6 times and put it down 7. She had his number. Minjun had handed her a folded piece of paper at the reception with no expression whatsoever, as if distributing personal phone numbers to strangers was a task he performed with the same routine efficiency as checking security perimeters. In case you need anything. On the 7th pickup, she dialed. He answered on the 2nd ring. Miss Voss. Not a question. I was wondering how long you'd wait. 3 weeks and 3 days in case you're counting. I was. The honesty knocked something loose in her chest, and she felt it rattle around inside her like a marble in a jar. The cooler. It's $12,000. I'm aware. You can't just buy someone a $12,000 cooler. That's not how the world works. It is exactly how the world works. Someone identifies a need. Someone fills it. The mechanism is simple. The mechanism is insane. I can't accept this. And yet it's already installed, and your flowers are benefiting. Are they? She looked at gardenias glowing with health inside their new home and pressed her lips together. That's not the point. Then what is the point, Sable? It was the first time he'd used her first name, and the sound of it, shaped by his accent into something that felt like a different word entirely, sent a charge through her she was wholly unprepared for. The point is, I don't understand what this is. You don't know me. We talked for 20 minutes. I had sauce on my chin. So why are you sending me equipment I can't afford and using my first name like we're something to each other? Silence. Long enough that she checked her phone. My mother speaks about you, Daejung said finally, his voice rougher, less rehearsed. Every day since the memorial. She says you have good hands and honest eyes, and that those two things are rarer than people realize. When she tells me someone is worth knowing, I listen. So this is about your mother? Another pause, heavier. It started as being about my mother. I'm no longer certain that's entirely the case. Sable closed her eyes. She should hang up. Should sever this before it grew roots deep enough to hurt when torn out. I want to see you, she said instead. Not in a car, not at a funeral, somewhere normal, somewhere I can sit across from you with clean hands and figure out what I'm dealing with. Name the place. Coffee shop on Broad Street, Kettlework, Saturday 9 o'clock. You come alone. No Minjun, no black sedans, just you. I should warn you that I have not been a normal person in a very long time. Saturday, 9 o'clock. Try your best. She hung up, pressed the phone against her chest, and stared at the ceiling while her heart hammered. She looked at the cooler humming against the back wall, at the gardenias inside it like small white promises, and thought about a woman named Yuna who had married into shadows and chosen to bring light instead. Saturday was coming. And Sable had never backed down from something just because it scared her. He came alone. Sable spotted him through the window of Kettlework before he saw her. He looked different outside formal clothing. Younger, in a dark Henley and charcoal trousers that managed to look expensive without trying. He paused inside the door with the brief, scanning alertness of someone who assessed exits and sightlines before choosing a seat. She raised a hand from her corner booth. You actually came alone, she said. You asked me to. Men in your position don't usually take instructions from florists. Men in my position don't usually meet florists for coffee on Saturday mornings. The ghost of a smile. And yet, here I am. So, where do we start? With the truth, Sable said. I've spent 3 weeks reading between the lines. I'm going to ask direct questions, and I'd like direct answers. He weighed her request. I can try, but there are things I won't be able to tell you. Knowing them would put you at risk of becoming involved in a world that doesn't let people leave easily. I want to be honest with you. That means being honest about the limits of my honesty. Okay. Then let me tell you what I think I know. She set down her mug. Your family is involved in organized crime. The people at that memorial moved like soldiers. Your mother is the matriarch. And you're at the center of it all. Whatever that means. It's shaped you into someone who doesn't know how to sit in a coffee shop without checking the exits first. The longest silence they had shared. You missed one thing, Daejung said. What? I checked the exits before I sat down, not after. She laughed, a quick, surprised sound that dissolved the weight between them. You're not wrong, he said. My family operates outside the law, and I oversee those operations. I've made choices I can't undo. He looked at his hands, and she noticed a thin scar along his right palm. But I am also a man sitting across from a woman he can't stop thinking about, trying to figure out how to be something other than what the world has made him. Something opened inside her chest, unexpected and insistent, like a bulb pushing through frozen ground. She reached across and touched the scar on his palm. I have conditions, she said. I would expect nothing less. I don't lie. Not for you. Not for your family. I don't participate in anything that hurts people. If something crosses my line, I say so, and you listen. And if we disagree about where the line is, we talk about it like adults. My conscience is mine. You don't get to borrow it. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. raw and reverent, like a man watching rain fall on soil that had been dry for years. Anything else? Yes. When it gets hard, and it will, you don't disappear behind your walls and shut me out. Those walls have been in place a long time. Dismantling them will take patience. I grow flowers for a living. Patience is literally my job. Something settled in his expression, and when he reached across and took her hand, his grip was warm and sure. Then we try, he said. Together. Together, she repeated, and the word tasted like the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. The weeks folded into each other like petals layering around a center neither of them could see. Saturdays at 9 became a fixed point. Daejung arrived alone each time, though Sable suspected Minjun orbited nearby. She didn't ask. It was one of many small negotiations she was learning to make. The conversations deepened gradually, invisibly. He told her about Seoul, about the house near Bukhansan Mountain before his father's ambitions pulled the family into darker currents. He described his mother's garden, maintained through every upheaval, seeds and cuttings carried across oceans like sacred texts. Sable understood that impulse. She told him about her grandmother's plot in Henrico County, the quarter-acre of red clay where she'd buried her fingers in soil at 7 and felt something alive responding to her touch. That's when you knew, Daejung said, not asking. That's when I knew. He began visiting the shop, appearing in the late afternoon after her last customer left, settling into the worn armchair near the counter with an ease that suggested he'd been sitting in uncomfortable places his entire life and had finally found one that didn't require vigilance. He watched her work with a fascination she found flattering and slightly unnerving, tracking the movement of her hands with the focused attention of someone studying a language he wanted desperately to learn. You don't use patterns, he observed one evening. No templates, no reference images. I feel it, Sable corrected, sliding a stem of Lisianthus into place alongside Ranunculus and Dusty Miller. Every flower has a personality. My job is to listen and translate. You talk about them like they're people. Some of them are better company than people. He laughed at that, a sound she treasured, deep and startled, as though it surprised him every time. It revealed a version of him few people had ever met. The version that made terrible puns about botanical names and once fell asleep in her armchair while she finished a wedding order. His face soft in a way that made her heart ache with a tenderness she didn't know how to contain. She had covered him with the blanket she kept behind the counter and worked in silence for 2 hours, checking on him between arrangements the way she checked on delicate transplants. Not because they needed it, but because the looking itself was a kind of care. Mrs. Park invited her to dinner. Then tea. Then an afternoon in the garden of the family's estate in Henrico County, where a climbing rose cascaded over a stone wall in pale coral. Una planted these, Mrs. Park said, her hand resting on a bloom with the careful reverence of someone touching a relic. She said they reminded her of sunrise over the Han River. I water them myself now. Every morning, before anything else. It is how I say good morning to her. Sable stood beside her, understanding she was being given something rare. The private geography of grief mapped in root systems and blooming cycles. They're beautiful. She had a good eye. She had a good heart, Mrs. Park corrected gently. The eye was just how it expressed itself. There were harder moments too, evenings when Daejung canceled plans with texts that explained nothing. Mornings when unfamiliar cars idled across from her shop. A night when he arrived with a cut above his eyebrow, he dismissed as nothing, and she cleaned it in silence, biting back every question pressing against her teeth. She was learning the rhythm of his world, learning to read his silences, to distinguish between the one that meant thinking and the one that meant carrying something too heavy to set down. learning that the cost of loving him was paid not in dramatic confrontations, but in small, daily surrenders of certainty. But she was also learning something that frightened her more than any of the rest. She wouldn't trade it. Not a single difficult, bewildering moment. And that realization was the most dangerous thing of all. The call came at 2 in the morning on a Thursday in late November, and Sable knew before she answered that something had broken. Not because of the hour, because she had felt it building for days. A pressure drop, a wrongness in the air that prickled against her skin. Dae-jung had been pulling away, his texts shorter, his calls less frequent, his explanations vague. He had missed their last 2 Saturdays, but the call shattered every reassurance she had been constructing. Sable. Minjun's voice, stripped of its usual neutrality, replaced with something alarmingly close to fear. Listen carefully. There's been an incident. Mr. Kong is safe, but Mrs. Park... He paused. Mrs. Park has been taken. Taken. The word arranged and rearranged itself. Mrs. Park. The woman who silenced crowds with a single word, who touched Yuna's roses with the tenderness of a prayer. Taken. By who? The Yoon family. A rival organization. They took her from the estate. Security was compromised. Someone on the inside. Sable was already dressed, moving on autopilot. Keys. Phone. Shoes. Where is Dae-jung? At the operations center. He's not handling it well. Making decisions too fast. Reacting instead of thinking. Everyone around him is too afraid to push back. Why are you calling me? Because you're the only person he might hear. This was the line. The boundary she'd promised herself she would never cross. Going to him now, entering a war room during a kidnapping crisis, meant stepping into his world permanently, with no door behind her to walk back through. Send me the address. The warehouse was in an industrial district south of the river. Minjun led her through corridors smelling of concrete and machine oil. The room was large and chaotic, screens lining walls, voices overlapping in Korean, English, and Mandarin. And in the center, Dae-jung. She barely recognized him. He was standing over a table of papers, hands braced on its surface, head bowed, shoulders trembling with a tension that looked less like anger and more like a man trying to hold a building up with his body. The men around him kept careful distance, orbiting someone who had become dangerously unstable. Dae-jung. She said his name from the doorway, and every conversation died at once. He looked up. The expression on his face nearly stopped her. Grief and fear and anguish, all warring behind eyes that had gone hollow with a desperation she had never seen in him before. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice wrecked. And yet, here I am. She crossed the room, ignoring stares, and stopped in front of him. Talk to me. They have my mother. They took her from her garden, Sable, from Yuna's roses. She was watering them, and they took her while her hands were still wet. The image shattered something inside her. That formidable woman dragged away from flowers she tended like a sacred duty, soil still under her fingernails. We're going to get her back, but not like this. Not from panic. I'm not panicking. But his hands were shaking. You're scaring every person in this room, which means they're not thinking clearly, which means mistakes are being made that could cost your mother her life. She took his hands, pressing them between hers until the trembling slowed. Here's what happens. You step away from this table, drink the water Minjun is about to bring you, then sit down and think. Really think. The way you've survived this long by doing. I'll be right here. The room held its breath. Every eye was on her. A woman with dirt under her fingernails giving orders to the man they all feared. Dae-jung stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, his shoulders dropped. His jaw unclenched. His fingers tightened around hers. Minjun. Water. The room exhaled. The panic thinned. Something more purposeful took its place. He drank. He sat. He pulled a chair beside his. 3 possible locations, he said, finding his way back to measured cadence. Surveillance on 2. The third is a property the Yun family acquired 6 months ago through a shell company. Remote. Difficult to approach. That's where she is. If I'm wrong and commit resources to the wrong location, you're not wrong. You know these people. Trust yourself. Something clicked behind his eyes, a mind snapping back into the clarity that had kept him alive this long. He began speaking in rapid Korean, and the room mobilized with coordinated efficiency. Minjun translated key points in murmurs. Approach strategy, extraction timeline, layered contingencies. Sable sat beside him through all of it, her hand resting on his forearm. A contact so light he might not have felt it if he hadn't kept glancing down at it like an anchor. 4 hours later, at 17 past 6 in the morning, Minjun's phone rang. He answered, listened, and turned to Dae-jung with an expression that broke through every layer of professional control he had ever maintained. They have her. She's alive. She's safe. She's asking for tea and complaining about the incompetence of the men who took her. The sound that escaped Dae-jung's throat was something between a laugh and a sob. He pressed his forehead against the table, and Sable placed her hand on the back of his neck and held it there while his shoulders shook. When he raised his head, his eyes were wet but clear. "Thank you," he said. "Thank whoever raised you to have good instincts." That would be the woman requesting tea from her rescuers. He covered her hand with his. "Stay, please. I want you here when she arrives." "I'm not going anywhere," Sable said, and meant it in ways that went far beyond the room. Mrs. Park arrived at the warehouse with the serene poise of a woman returning from an inconvenient errand rather than a 9-hour kidnapping. She walked through the door flanked by 2 of Dae-jung's men, who looked considerably more shaken than she did, their faces carrying the particular disorientation of professionals who had expected to rescue a victim and found instead a woman who had apparently spent her captivity critiquing her captor's hospitality. There was a bruise on her left wrist, dark and spreading, and a cut near her hairline where blood had dried in a thin line against her silver-streaked hair, details that made Sable's stomach clench with fury. But Mrs. Park's eyes were sharp and clear and imperious, and when she saw Dae-jung crossing toward her, she lifted her chin and said, in English, "You took your time." He stopped before her with the helpless expression of a child who had spent 9 hours imagining the worst possible version of his life without her. He said something in Korean, low and rough, words that cracked apart before he could finish them. Mrs. Park placed both hands on his face, holding him with a grip that was gentle and fierce and certain, and for a moment they stood there, mother and son, the matriarch and the man she had made. And the entire warehouse went silent around them with a reverence that required no instruction. Then she released him, straightened her jacket, and turned to Sable. "You came. Minjun called me. Minjun is smarter than he looks." She took Sable's hands. "You have been holding my son together. He is calmer than he should be. That is your doing. He did the hard part. I just reminded him he knew how." Mrs. Park guided her to chairs against the wall. She didn't release her hand. "When I was 24, she said, I married a man who frightened everyone who knew him. But I was not afraid, because I had seen something in him that fear makes invisible." "What?" "Loneliness. The terrible loneliness of a person taught that love is weakness and tenderness is liability." He had become so skilled at performing invulnerability that he'd forgotten it was a performance. I did not save him. What I did was refuse to accept the performance. I insisted on seeing the man behind it, even when he fought me. Did it work? He died in his garden, 71 years old, on his knees in the dirt, planting bulbs for a spring he wouldn't see. Heart attack, quick and clean. Her eyes glistened. Was it easy? No. There were years I wanted to leave. Years the fear was so constant it became like weather you stopped noticing. But the life we built between the hard parts, meals and gardens and arguments about nothing and mornings where he brought me coffee before I asked, that life was worth every sacrifice. She cupped Sable's face, and tears spilled before Sable knew they were coming. You are not me, and Daejung is not his father. You will build your own version of that life, but you are not alone in it, child. You never were. Sable nodded, unable to speak, and Mrs. Park wiped her tears with thumbs that smelled of rose water and earth. Now, someone mentioned tea, and I have been waiting 9 hours. If this building does not contain a proper kettle, there will be consequences. The Yun family's retaliation came not with violence, but with something far more surgical. 3 days after Mrs. Park's rescue, Sable found a notice taped to her shop door. A building code violation. 14 pages of dense legalese citing structural deficiencies, electrical hazards, and insufficient ventilation that had never been mentioned by her landlord, the building inspector who'd signed off on her lease, or the 2 subsequent inspectors who'd evaluated the property for insurance purposes. 14 days to address all violations or vacate the premises. She stood on the sidewalk reading it twice, a bucket of fresh peonies balanced on her hip, while the morning traffic on Carey Street ground past without caring. Her landlord expressed apologetic surprise when she called, then suggested, with a reluctance that sounded rehearsed, that she consider finding a new location. A generous offer for the building had arrived from a development company he'd never heard of. The numbers were too significant to ignore. He was sorry. His hands were tied. These things happened. The company, Sable discovered after an hour searching public records on her laptop between customer orders, was registered to an address that didn't exist, managed by a person with no digital footprint, and incorporated exactly 4 days ago, the day after Mrs. Park's rescue. She understood. She was being squeezed. Not with guns, but with bureaucratic machinery that could dismantle a life one permit at a time. She didn't tell Daejung. The man who had nearly lost his mother was standing at the edge of something dark and corrosive, held back by threads of restraint fraying with each passing hour. Adding her problems felt less like asking for help and more like handing a match to someone sitting next to gasoline. But Daejung found out anyway, and the night he appeared at her apartment with the notice in his hand, she understood the crisis she'd been trying to prevent had arrived. How long? He asked, the paper trembling in his grip. 4 days. 4 days. He stepped inside and closed the door with a control more frightening than any slam. They're coming after you because of me, and you didn't tell me. Because I knew what you'd do. You don't know what I'd do. You'd burn them down. You'd use every resource you have to destroy the people who did this, and you'd lose another piece of yourself in the process. The piece I fell in love with. The piece that falls asleep in my armchair because you feel safe enough to close your eyes. He turned to the window. She watched his reflection, watched the battle playing out across features he thought she couldn't see. They won't stop, he said, his voice tight with a control that was costing him everything. The shop is the beginning. They'll go after your suppliers, your clients, your credit, your reputation. They will take apart everything you've built. Because hurting you is the most effective way to hurt me. I know. He turned back, and she saw it. The cracks running through the foundation of everything he held in place. You know, and you're standing there looking at me like I should be calm? They are dismantling your life. The thing you built with your own hands. Because I was selfish enough to want something good and foolish enough to think I could have it without someone weaponizing it against me. His voice broke. He pressed his back against the wall and slid down until he sat on the floor, knees drawn up and hands covering his face. He didn't weep the way he had at the warehouse, with the contained grief of a man accustomed to hiding his wounds. This was different. This was everything coming apart at once. Every wall, every defense, every careful partition between the man he was and the man he wanted to be collapsing into rubble. The sounds coming from behind those hands were ragged and raw and entirely without defense, and they filled the small apartment with a pain so honest it was almost unbearable to witness. Sable crossed the room and sat beside him on the cold floor, close enough that their shoulders touched, but not so close she crowded him. She had learned this about grief. It needed space as much as it needed company, and the trick was offering both without choosing for the person which one they needed more. Listen to me. You are not responsible for what they do. You didn't choose this, and you don't get to carry it alone. Everything I touch is better for your touching it. She pulled one hand from his face and held it. My shop was a dream held together with tape and stubbornness before you. The cooler saved 6 months of inventory. Your mother's commission paid 3 months of rent. And the man on my floor right now sat in my armchair last Tuesday and told me my arrangement for the Whitfield wedding was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. She pressed her lips to his knuckles, tasting salt. They can take my shop. Buildings are buildings. I can grow flowers in a parking lot if I have to. What they cannot take is us. The thing we're building that has nothing to do with square footage, and everything to do with the fact that you are the first person who ever looked at my hands and saw something worth holding on to. He lowered his other hand and looked at her. Eyes red, swollen, entirely without armor. She saw him then. Not the crime lord, not the strategist. Just Dae-jung, a man in love with no idea how to protect the thing he loved without destroying it in the process. I don't deserve you, he whispered. Probably not. But I didn't ask for what I deserved. I asked for what I wanted. And what I want is you. All of you. Including the parts that scare me. He pulled her against him, arms wrapping around her with a fierceness that pressed the air from her lungs. They sat on the cold floor, tangled together like roots that had grown so completely around each other that separating them would kill them both. We fight this, she said against his skin. Not your way. We find another path. One that protects us without costing us who we are. And if that path doesn't exist, then we build it. That's what I do, remember? I make things grow in places where nothing is supposed to survive. He held her tighter, and she felt a decision being made, not with words, but with the pressure of arms and the refusal to let go. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning that dawned gray and cold with the first real chill of December pressing against the windows, Dae-jung Kong sat across from his mother in her garden and told her he wanted out. Not the garden, the life, the empire, the inherited machinery of power and compromise that had defined his family for 3 generations and shaped every choice he had made since he was old enough to understand what choices meant. Mrs. Park listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around tea, her gaze fixed on the bare canes of Yuna's climbing rose, skeletal and patient against the stone wall, waiting for spring. The garden around them had surrendered to December, the flower beds stripped to brown earth, the stone paths edged with frost that wouldn't melt until afternoon. Only the evergreen hedges held their color, dark and stubborn against the gray sky. When he finished, she was quiet a long time, long enough for the tea to cool, long enough for a cardinal to land on the garden fence, tilt its head, and fly away. Your father wanted out once, she said. Did I ever tell you that? No. He was 35. You were 7. He came to me and said he wanted to start over as ordinary people with ordinary problems. He'd researched countries with no extradition treaties, calculated how much money we'd need, even picked out a house. She smiled, small and sad and luminous. A house with a garden. He knew that was the only thing that would convince me. What happened? Life happened. the way it always does when you try to leave a world that doesn't believe in doors. She turned to him. But you are not your father, and this is not his world anymore. It's yours. And what do I do with it? Change it. Not abandon it. Change it. Dismantle the parts that poison everything they touch. Keep the parts that protect the people who depend on you, and build something your children can inherit without inheriting the shadows. She glanced at Sable, sitting on the garden bench 3 feet away pretending to examine a dormant hydrangea. The look was brief, and loaded with enough meaning to fill a library. Sable's cheeks burned despite the December chill. It will take time, Daejung said. Everything worth building takes time. Ask the woman who grows flowers. Sable looked up and found them both watching her, mother and son, 2 people who had survived things she was only beginning to understand. She's right, Sable said, standing and crossing to him. She placed her hands on his shoulders and felt the tension in them. You don't have to burn it down. You don't have to run. You just have to grow something different in the same soil. Is that possible? He asked, looking up at her with fragile, desperate hope. The expression of someone asking permission to believe in something they'd been told didn't exist. I make things bloom in August heat and December frost. Possible is my entire job. He covered her hands with his, and the tension began to release. Not completely, but enough. Enough to breathe. Enough to begin. Mrs. Park watched from across the table, her tea forgotten, and her face soft with an emotion she would never name aloud. She looked at the bare canes of Yuna's rose, at the thorns catching gray December light, at the places where new growth would emerge when the season turned. Spring will come, she said, to no one in particular and to everyone at once. And Sable, standing in a garden that smelled of cold earth and dormant promise, her hands on the shoulders of a man she loved in ways that defied every rational argument against it, believed her. Because she had spent her entire life learning the one truth that flowers taught better than anything else in the world. That the most beautiful things grow in the spaces where you least expect them to survive.